Hello, my name is Felicia Gminski, and today I will be analyzing the first chapter of Michael Brown's text, Whitewashing Race, the Myth of a Colorblind Society. To begin, let's talk about the focus points of the chapter. Three main discussions that Brown draws focus to are analyzing white Americans' perceptions towards people of color, white people's ability to be able to dismiss white privilege or deny the existence of white privilege, and how modern white Americans are able to dismiss the struggles and voices of people of color in regards to systematic inequality under the notion that, comparatively, our society has progressed since its times of segregation and racism. Because white privilege is invisible, it is common to describe racists and non-racists as very different kinds of people. White people are able to look past and misunderstand that their identity is benefited by privileges that people of color are not able to experience. While white people see their standard of living as the norm, people of color deal with discriminatory facets of life on a regular basis. Michael Brown explains that white people are still likely to hold their prejudiced beliefs against people of color as a result of misperceiving the reality of black lives. Brown quotes a well-known philosophical maxim by stating, "The last thing a fish notices is the water." Things that are unproblematic seem natural and tend to go unnoticed. Fish take the water they swim in for granted. White privilege, like the water that sustains fish, is invisible in their analysis. White Americans also hold the concept of racism at a specific standard. From a lens of privilege, it is easier to deny being racist than it is to understand that racism is more than motivated, crude, explicitly supremacist, and being typically expressed as an individual bias, rather than racism being presented in everyday situations such as stereotyping, equity differences, and general prejudices against people of color amongst other means of oppression. Racism is still thriving within our modern-day society, but the focus is instead directed to how our society has improved by comparison. By focusing on the progress that has been made in regards to integration and acceptance of diversity, we ignore the progress that still needs to be made. This is an ongoing challenge, but our society has acted as though the problem has been fixed, so where are these claims coming from? Isn't racism dead? Well, not exactly. The problem is that we still have quite a bit of work to do. While it's easy to think that we as a society have moved on to a more understanding and accepting culture, data has proved otherwise. Brown discusses how the Supreme Court's requirements for the condemnation of white people versus people of color has grown to become even more challenging, as the court has increasingly required that plaintiffs in equal protection of discrimination cases not only may, but must probe defendants' moves. By requiring proof of the oppressor's intent to harm or elicit a negative reaction from those who are affected by this discrimination, we allow the oppressors to have a higher chance of getting away with their prejudiced or discriminatory behavior without being held accountable for their actions. After all, how can one prove a person's intentions for certain if there is no concrete evidence outside of a situation such as a single physical or verbal altercation? Racism is still alive and well, as exemplified in various surveys that Brown references in this chapter. One survey conducted in the Detroit area during the year 1992 presented white residents with an option to move into a neighborhood whose population consisted of varying percentages of black residents. As the hypothetical percentage of non-white people in the neighborhood increased, white residents responding to the survey were less likely to want to live in the integrated neighborhood. Another survey conducted by the University of Chicago's National Opinion Research Center in 1990 revealed that when asked to compare people of color and other ethnic groups to white people, over 50% of respondents believed that black people were lazier than other groups, were more prone to violence, and were less intelligent. In 1978, when asked, 88% of white Americans agreed that non-white people have the right to live where they please, yet only 40% of respondents said that they would vote for a law that prevented homeowners from being prejudiced towards home buyers that were non-white. So, with all of this information compiled and presented, who is this message meant for? As the information in this text is shared, it seems evident that this book, but more specifically this chapter, seems intended to reach a white audience, primarily white Americans, as the chapter references statistics involving white American respondents, in an effort to convey the struggles that people of color still face in a society today where being colorblind to racism is doing more damage rather than helping those who have suffered from oppression or discrimination due to racism. Something worth considering that Michael Brown draws attention to is a concept that is suggested in the chapter regarding white people and the statistics surrounding their perception to race as a result of lower education, low equity, and a lack of professional lifestyle. Brown states, when tolerance means verbalizing principles acquired through exposure to liberal media class institutions, lower and working class whites will appear to be more racist than middle class whites. Without the exposure to an education that is more revealing towards the factual evidence of discrimination in our society, it is easier for white folk to remain ignorant to the modern struggles of people of color. Something else to think about is, Michael Brown also allows readers to consider the fact that people simply don't seem to care. In the chapter, Brown states, it becomes apparent that those who argue that racism has declined ignore critical evidence that contradicts their assumptions. This statement comes across as significant because it seems to speak volumes about how perception can be shaped, regardless of factual contradicting evidence. It is irritating and shocking to think that even when presented with facts, people can still choose to live in their own construed realities. How do we manage to convey an understanding of facts to people that choose to believe otherwise? After exploring this chapter, I am left with a question. How do we as librarians convince people to believe factual information when their perceptions have been formed under false pretenses and they are resistant to believing otherwise? While constructing a position regarding the perception of people of color in the eyes of white folk, we did not see an alternative suggestion to fix this issue. How do we convey facts to people that choose to ignore them? While this is a hypothetical question, I also understand that this exemplifies yet another aspect of privilege. My own privilege as a white American comes into play because the responsibility of figuring out how to go about this denial of factual information should be focused on by white Americans in an effort to amend the misconceived notions white Americans have against people of color, rather than relying on people of color to do the legwork of providing white people with answers. My final take on this chapter. To deny that racism is still a problem in our society is to remain ignorant to factual information and the true life experiences of people of color. Librarians will find that a prime responsibility of their career is helping to make their library feel accessible to its patrons of all diverse natures. With that, I leave you with 2 questions to consider. What sort of programs or resources can we offer library patrons that help them understand how to check the legitimacy of their primary sources of information? What sort of programs or resources could a library offer to represent its diverse demographic of patrons? On that note, thank you for listening, and please feel free to reach out with any further comments, questions, or suggestions.